Hey everyone, got a couple more videos to make before I wrap things up in Canada and fly back to the US. First is going to be this exotic weapon tier list update. We have some new exotics in the game, of course, Whirling Ovation, stuff like that. And we have a bunch of old exotics that have been buffed, some of them have been nerfed as a result of system changes. And we're going to talk about what I think is going to be in the top tiers, in the bottom tiers, what has changed, what hasn't changed going into this video. I'm not going to be covering every single change because a lot of this was just me making the exotic weapon tier list a little bit more decisive and a little bit more tight in terms of tiering. So some of these changes, it's just going to be a bunch of stuff like moving down a tier or two. So I'm not going to comment on that unless it's like really meta, and I should comment on it because it's something people might be interested in. So with that out of the way, today we're going to go over this exotic weapon tier list a little differently than we normally do. So I'm going to cover the top 3 tiers because there's the tiers that, you know, the people care about the most, and it's really only like, what, 10 weapons, so it's not really much to talk about. And then we're going to categorize things into primaries, specials, heavy weapons, and finally utility weapons, which are like, you know, Navigator, Lumina, that kind of thing. So first, let's talk about the S tier that I've chosen this season. So Choir 1 remains in the S tier. By the way, there's no ordering within tiers here, so this is just all alphabetical. Choir isn't necessarily better than Tractor, even though they're pretty hard to compare, I would say. But Choir 1, yeah, it's still insanely versatile. Even if the hipfire was potentially changed, the ADS mode has increased precision damage. I don't mean by what I'm saying here. I mean, like, literally, I am of the belief that Choir 1 got a buff, a small, like 14% buff to its ADS mode. So it's even more ammo efficient than before in that regard. Even now, just like dealing with chunkier targets like champs and stuff, you can just ADS and like the champ will melt, especially if you have something like Onslaught. So still really, really great. Very, very optimal, I would say. An excellent pairing with something like Mint Retrograde if you're doing double special. I feel like everyone's using Mint, Choir, and Eager Edge Sword for solo ops and stuff like that. So Choir 1, still a absolutely fantastic weapon in the S tier. And you can see here, I've also adjusted these categories that exist for ranking these exotic weapons. I believe I got rid of GMs because GMs don't exist in the game anymore. We have roam content, which is like solo ops, conquest, stuff like that, where you're moving around, you're dealing with maybe champs, and your goal is to stay mobile and to just kill enemies in an effective manner, right? While maybe keeping up ammo for yourself. DPS is specifically fire team, raid, and dungeon DPS, which is where DPS is really the most relevant. Solo DPS stuff like killing a solo ops boss at the end of a solo op, that's going to be more in the roam category. Day 1, I don't think I need to explain this one. Survivability, consistency, stuff like that, total damage. Challenge content, this is going to be more toward like solo raid encounters, maybe solo flawless dungeons, stuff like that is going to be fitting into challenge content, maybe duos and trios of certain encounters as well. Speedrunning, don't think I really need to explain that either. So yeah, you can see here, Choir is optimal in a lot of these different circumstances. I think for DPS, it's not even really situational. I just wouldn't use it for DPS anymore, but it's still very, very good in all of these other scenarios. Tractor Cannon, don't think I really need to explain this one. I moved it from A to S tier, so actually used to be in the A tier last season. I think it's more important than ever now that Bungie is showcasing some very long phase, high total damage bosses. I think everybody is really opting for Tractor over Tether in almost every encounter now, unless you're doing something like Grapple Melee, where you're not really using your super for anything, so you may as well put on Tether. So Tractor is absolutely great. Also technically got a duo buff because Mint Retrograde is in the game now, and now Tractor users have a very, very, very obvious weapon pairing in terms of what should I use when I'm on Tractor? Use Mint Retrograde. So I think that's also something that has buffed Tractor's, I don't know, usability, I guess. You know, Tractor damage is really straightforward now. You just use Mint Retrograde, and then you can maybe dump PK SMG or something if you want after that. Or just stay on PK SMG the whole time. It's really up to you. So yeah, Tractor and Choir in the S tier. I don't think there's no surprises there. A tier is up next. A tier, Lord of Wolves. Used to be in the S tier. I downgraded it to the A tier. Lord of Wolves got a very large reserve nerf. One of the big things with Lord of Wolves was not only was it crazy high in DPS, but also it had very, very high reserves. Way too high, to be honest with you. So I'm glad those reserves kind of got tuned back a little bit. It now has under 200. It used to have like 270. But yeah, Lord of Wolves, for DPS at least, it's still very competitive. Wasn't nerfed across the patch. But it is a little situational, right? And if you do miss crits with Lord of Wolves, I don't think people realize just how much damage you miss when you miss crits with Lord of Wolves. So you kind of need a div, or you need an enemy that's very large head hitbox and sits very still. So yeah, Lord of Wolves, it's definitely still great. It's still great for total damage. It's just nowhere near as versatile as something like a Tractor or a Choir 1. So yeah, Lord of Wolves in the A tier. Parasite was already in the A tier. It's unchanged. But I will say just it's a spotlight pick this season because of Mint Retrograde. It buffs Mint damage by 15%, and it has pretty good total damage as well, right? So Parasite, pretty solid stuff. We love warm byproducts here. Navigator, I moved it from C to the A tier. Navigator shifts up and down depending on how good Grapple Melee is. Grapple Melee, after the stylish nerfs and the syntho nerfs and blah 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 and everything that happened in the past couple seasons, definitely was on a downturn in terms of valuability, and now it's back better than ever. So Navigator in the A tier, kind of have to put it there. It's also nice to like heal and give Woven Mail to your teammates, so that's pretty chill as well. Next up in the B tier, we have Gallarhorn. Gallarhorn is pretty niche, unfortunately. It's still nice in some encounters, for example, like in solo gatekeepers, you use it for like ad clear. So it's still a very, very good ad clear weapon. It's like a one and done, very easy brain dead application weapon for just clearing out a whole room. But in terms of just like actual DPS utility, rockets are still kind of niche. They are still kind of niche right now. We're still in like an exotic heavy, exotic special, plus legendary like meta and like super spam meta, and Galley doesn't really fit with that. Galley is very much like a sort of like speedrunner optimization damage kind of weapon. So yeah, rockets are nice and they're good, but there's no really reason to use them in the current sandbox with everything that we have right now, for obvious reasons. Okay, next up we have Grand Overture. So Grand Overture, C tier to B tier. It got probably, I would say, a stealth buff to my estimation, like we talked about in previous videos, and it has good consistent total damage. The only thing holding Grand Overture back is that it just doesn't do, you know, super generation justice, right? It just doesn't do a lot of super gen. So because of that, it's not going to be as good as something like an Outbreak for super generation. It's not going to be good as something like a Barrow Dyad or like other PK legendary SMGs. So that's really going to hold it back a little bit. And then its DPS is not that competitive. It's definitely decent. It's probably higher than Thunderlord if you have like missiles loaded as in the volley, like coming into damage. But in terms of like raw viability, it low-key maybe even deserves C tier, but I think a lot of day one teams appreciate its consistency, and so I've put it into the B tier. Okay, next up we have New Land Beyond. New Land Beyond, this thing, I think I underrated it in past patches. I moved it up from the C tier to the B tier. It has insane total damage, like we've talked about. One of the big problems with New Land Beyond was its reload and having to like pull back the bolt, like the bolt action, every time you have to reload, and then you have to like do both animations. That definitely held back its DPS a little bit. And now the catalyst, now that you have times 20, you can fire indefinitely, right? So really, really nice change for New Land Beyond. I think it's also great for mini bosses. I mean, it can 2-tap most mini bosses, even under contests, you know, stuff like the crits on the Harpy. If you're fine with not running an exotic heavy and losing ammo and stuff like that, New Land Beyond is an excellent weapon for total damage. And for a weapon that is this much of an outlier in total damage, its DPS is actually quite competitive, higher than stuff like Grand Overture and Thunderlord, which is pretty impressive for a special weapon. Okay, next up we have Outbreak. Outbreak is unchanged. I kind of rated it pretty highly last patch, I believe, because of super generation, and I did say I think this weapon is underrated. In fireteam scenarios, this thing is knocking on the door of consistent heavy weapon options that people tend to glaze a lot for contest. And so I think I was right, because everyone is using Outbreak now for everything. Now, I do think Outbreak right now is a little overrated. There's definitely people right now, even people in the endgame community, who would no doubt put Outbreak into the S tier. However, I do think Outbreak is a little bit overrated for ad clear. 2500 DPS is pretty decent and probably enough to clear most contest activities. And it does have infinite total. So, you know, you got to give it some marks for consistency, just like how I gave Grand Overture marks for consistency. But there are better primary options, even though some of them do require exotics like Peacekeepers. There are better primary options. And I'm looking into stuff like hierarchy triple ring stacking. And I definitely want to talk more about that in future videos. So keep your eyes peeled for that. But for now, Outbreak, I think B tier is a totally like valid placement for it. It's not insanely versatile. I think people are overselling its ad clear potential a little bit. If I didn't have not swap active in like contest or something, I definitely swap from Outbreak to something else. If I was using Outbreak on damage, I would definitely change to something else during ad clear phases. There's some places where maybe you want to have everybody on Outbreak for ad clear phases as well, but you kind of get my point. It's not like insanely versatile. Okay, Still Hunt. This one is probably the one I was most reluctant on putting into the B tier. The B tier would be quite tight if I dropped stuff like Grand Overture and Still Hunt. It would be just 3 weapons, just like the A tier. But yeah, I think Still Hunt is borderline acceptable in the B tier. And the reason for that is because still used in speedrunning for some things. Like there are some things where it's basically like 3 Izzy shots or like 1 really high power Izzy shot. And, you know, it doesn't require you to hone or anything like that. You get it instantly off the rally. And there's just some utility that Still Hunt provides still that isn't replaced by another special weapon, or certainly not by a legendary weapon. So I think for DPS, like I've put here, it is definitely a situational weapon now. It's definitely not as good as it used to be by a long shot. But I think that utility that it provides, kind of like New Land Beyond, where it's like good for mini bosses and stuff, just being able to one-shot stuff and like penetrate certain shields, I do think that is valuable in some cases. And so I do want to give it like B tier, but it would be like B- tier if I could give it a B- tier. That's it for the top 3 tiers. That was a lot of talking. Let's move on to primary. So I'm actually going to filter this tier list by primary. We're going to filter out utility weapons here real quick because we're going to talk about that in a separate section. So this really makes it clear kind of what you're competing with, right? So let's go ahead and talk about some of these highlights. So Barrow Dyad, I've moved from D to C tier. It's decent boss DPS, right? It competes with Outbreak. When you account for super spam being better on Barrow Dyad with Peacekeepers, it probably bests Outbreak by a little bit, especially if you're not dealing with instant max stacking, instant max scaling, or a really, really long phase. Barrow Dyad will probably best Outbreak with Peacekeepers in that situation, but it's obviously restricted to a single class. Okay, so that's kind of important as well. Graviton Spike. So this is our first new exotic that we're talking about. I think it's deserving of being in the C tier. It has on-hit splash effects that only require 3 crits. A lot of the stuff in the C tier that people love, you know, the classics, Graviton Lance, Sunshot, Trinity Gold, these all require kills to keep their chains going, whereas Graviton Spike only requires crits. So it's just as good on stuff like mini-bosses. You know, Sunshot is not a gun that you'd really shoot at a champ repeatedly because it's very inefficient to do so, whereas Graviton Spike, I feel like you could shoot it at a champ and just reproc those effects over and over and over, and it could still be potentially good for doing chip damage to that champ and not as inefficient as something like a Graviton Lance or a Sunshot or certainly a Trinity. I've always preached in endgame content that effects that are on hit rather than on kill activation are always going to be favored, and if it's on hit splash, it's going to be great as well. So Graviton Spike, obviously not great for boss damage, but pretty good for ad clear. I'll leave it in the C tier. Plus it's craftable, you know, has some nice catalysts as well, like temporal alignment. So pretty cool stuff. Next up, we have Kvostov 7G0X, or just exotic Kvostov. I actually moved this from B to C tier. I don't think it's deserving of being in the B tier. Part of the reason is I just restricted tiers more this season. So if you look at the stuff that's in the B tier, like Grand Overture and New Land Beyond, Kvostov is obviously not at that power level. But I know a lot of day one teams, like for example, the Passion team right now, they love using Kvostov because its bouncing bullet allows you to tag a bunch of ads as a fire team. And for those of you that don't know, ammo generation, when you get an assist on an enemy, even if it's not a final blow, you still get ammo generation credit partially to some degree. As long as you tag the enemy. So Kvostov, being an exotic primary, you know, has good ammo generation. You can boost it as well. It's good for, like, you know, tagging a bunch of ads and just getting a lot of ammo. However, I will say it's kind of a solution to a problem that doesn't necessarily exist, right? There are plenty of weapons that you can use to tag enemies that are not Kvostov, that are maybe more annoying to tag enemies with, but you can certainly do it. And maybe their ammo generation potential, their raw ammo gen stat is going to be more favorable, or, you know, maybe you don't want to use a primary, you know, you want to use an exotic heavy instead. And in, you know, spots like Knot Swap, or even if you just want to preserve your heavy ammo, you can't really use Kvostov, right? So because of that limitation, I'm going to place it in the C tier, but I'm not going to put it in the D tier, right? Like, its ad clear potential is still pretty good. It's on hit rather than on kill, or on orb pickup, let's say, as well. So yeah, I think Kvostov deserves to be in the C tier, but it's nowhere near as versatile and is like fully effective and universally covering as something like an Outbreak or a Grand Overture or a New Land Beyond in the B tier, right? So Kvostov, I think C tier, pretty solid placement for it. Graviton Lance, like we mentioned, Necrochasm, Sunshot, Trinity Ghoul. These are just the classic splashy ad clear options. Just going to put them in the C tier. That's kind of where they belong. By the way, in the future, in all of these weapon tabs, you guys have been asking me to add the season that a weapon came out, as well as the ammo generation stat of that weapon, and we're definitely going to do that. So keep your eyes peeled for that, and I will definitely consider ammo generation stats in the future when we're talking about weapon tiering and stuff like that. New factor that we haven't really had to consider before. We considered reserves before, but there wasn't that much variance between different weapons of the same type. And ammo generation stat, there's definitely quite a bit of variance between different weapons in the same family. So we're definitely going to consider that more in the future. But for now, for this season, for this patch, for this specific video, we're not going to talk about ammo generation stat because I haven't included it in the tier list. Okay, so there's that. Next up, third iteration, our second new weapon that we're going to talk about here. Unfortunately, I have placed it into the D tier. Now, third iteration, we talked about it for boss DPS. It's pretty bad. So don't use third iteration for boss DPS. It's not very good. And then I would say the way its exotic perk works, as well as its catalyst, is that it really wants you to get these concentrated amalgamation round kills, right? You want to mark a target and then either kill it or kill it with that mark bullet. And so, unfortunately, this does promote a very slow playstyle, slow range playstyle, which is not very compatible with encounter design these days and how people play the game at a high level these days. So I'm going to have to place it in the D tier. It's like a cool weapon, and it's like decent for survivability and just getting invisibility on any, you know, kind of subclass. It's kind of like Rat King in that regard, I guess, to some degree. So I guess it kind of makes sense that they're in the same tier. But yeah, it's just too slow of a playstyle, and it doesn't do anything particularly like splashy or amazing in the same way that something like a Graviton Lance or a Graviton Spike would, right? And then finally, the last primary I want to talk about is hierarchy of needs, which I placed in the D tier. Now, you might be surprised if you're a hierarchy glazer. You might be surprised that this is in the D tier. This is a temporary placement. I want to say this right now. This is a temporary placement, right? Hierarchy of needs, I'm just rating this basically purely on its ad clear potential and its one ring potential. Its one ring potential, I think the way most people are using hierarchy right now is not stacking hierarchy rings. Maybe people don't know that you can stack hierarchy rings. Maybe people treat it like galley, where they're like, oh, I'm going to be on hierarchy, so you guys don't need to be on hierarchy. Maybe there's that implication there. I will say, though, I do think hierarchy is best used when you do stack 3 rings together. Because for those of you that don't know, up to 3 rings can be stacked. And each ring almost doubles the damage of a legendary bow. And so triples, quadruples, like bows are horrible for boss DPS. Their damage profile is horrible. But anything that's horrible, when you buff it by quadruple, is going to be potentially pretty decent. So I'm definitely going to do more boss DPS testing with hierarchy, with stacking rings. But for now, this rating is purely based on single ring and ad clear, right? And ad clear wise, hierarchy is fine. They gave it a lot of quality of life buffs, but the setup time required, especially when you have downtime between moving between areas and stuff like that, and the fact that you kind of need to hunker down and kind of place a turret, the ring rotating is definitely a nice quality of life change. And the fact that you get rings back pretty fast now and it's only 3 stacks instead of 6, that's also quite nice as well. But it's not enough to really compete with something like that's just on hit and instant, like Graviton Spike or Sunshot or Necrochasm, stuff like that. So I know people are definitely going to argue about that, but in a day one scenario, if you asked a high level player, would they rather go with something like a hierarchy or a Kabostov, they would not even bat an eye at you. Like, unless the hierarchy was for damage, it would not even be a contest. It would not even be a contest. So I'm talking strictly endgame PvE here. Hierarchy for ad clear, definitely lower on the rungs compared to some of the stuff in the C tier. If for DPS though, I find that it's a very strong option. You might even see it move up to B tier or C tier because that would make it a lot more versatile, right? Would be more of a DPS tool at that point. So yeah, that's it for hierarchy. Just wanted to have a little mention about that. And let's go ahead and move on to specials. Specials, we've already talked about the B tier. Fourth Horseman sits alone as the only special non-utility weapon in the C tier. I've actually moved it down from B to C tier because burst damage specials are a lot less relevant in the current meta, much like Merciless. Fourth Horseman kind of struggles to find an identity outside of speedrunning where you're really optimizing those one-shot mini-boss kills. But on a day one, I don't know, outside of like maybe a final stand or like bursting down a specific mini-boss or something like that, really situational in its usage. And then for actual DPS as well, Fourth Horseman desperately needs a reload assist in the form of like Whisper of Impetus or Rain of Fire. And, you know, those exotics, I mean, you can use them with like backers and stuff like that with post-buff backers, but you're really making compromises there, and it's really like a situational weapon in those contexts. So Fourth Horseman, gotta move it to the C tier. Also, I have restricted tiers, again, like I talked about. So I think Stillhunt has a bigger niche than Fourth Horseman in a couple pieces of content. So yeah, there's that. Buried Bloodline, big tier shift from me here. I've actually moved it from A tier last season down to the D tier. And I know this is a big tier shift, but I think I hugely overrated non-Feed the Void Devour usage on non-Devour subclasses. I think it's actually not that useful, and good builds shouldn't rely on Buried Bloodline to keep Devour timer up or even keep Devour to begin with. They have their own survivability kind of gameplay loop, and Buried Bloodline, once you add it onto that loop, doesn't really do that much for these builds. On top of that, its actual ad clear potential compared to something like a Choir, which I know is a high bar, right? And Choir doesn't give you Devour, but it's night and day. It's like a huge difference. Buried Bloodline, it's not bad. You know, on paper, its ammo economy is not terrible, but the lack of splash, you know, the lack of flint, it's kind of like, it feels kind of like a, I don't know, like Ariana's, but with less punch, you know? It's just like, it's single target. I don't know. Something about it, it just doesn't really sit with me, to be honest with you. I tried using it a little bit, and even with its catalyst, you know, it's fine, but it's not particularly amazing. I would say maybe D tier is a bit harsh, but I would say D tier, by the way, is not a bad placement in this tier list. I don't really like letter grades because people assign like a emotion toward them, right? They're like, oh, D tier must be horrible. But really, the tier list this season looks like this. Let me just make this clear, right? S tier is like, you can take it anywhere. Like it is going to be, someone is going to have it on in almost every activity if they're like an endgame PvE player, right? So someone's going to have it on. A tier is like supplemental like benefits or just like really strong options that you can take in a lot of scenarios but are not necessarily like universal, right? Because Tractor and Choir, you can take them literally everywhere, right? And then B tier and C tier are going to be stuff that's like pretty strong, but it's limited in use, right? It's a little situational. It's best in slot for certain things, and then D tier is going to be stuff that's like, they're good exotics, but you have to have a really specific reason for using them. You know, you have to have a really specific reason for using them. Like, let me give you an example. Like Dead Messenger, It's great for like special wave ad clear, but it's like, I don't know, it's got some decent total damage, but you have to have like a reason to use Dead Messenger. You know what I'm saying? Like, you're gonna be like, oh, you know, I have an exotic special slot and I don't want to use Choir for whatever reason. Like, I need a splash ad clear some ads, you know? It's kind of like that. Or like conditional, where it's like, oh, I really want that freeze ignite potential on like certain champ types. Or Ariana's Vow, where you're like, oh, I want to destroy oracles, or I need Verity refreshes in you know, for in Vow or like Vogue or something, right? Like, there's really specific scenarios where these make sense. And Bared Bloodline, I didn't think it was an E tier exotic. E tier exotics, I haven't made this clear. E tier exotics are basically on this tier list where they're better than a legendary in endgame PvE, but it's like very difficult to find a reason to use them. It's stuff like Delicate Tomb and Cold Heart. Like, these days, there's kind of no reason to use these two exotics if you're trying to play optimally in endgame PvE, unless they're part of like a very specific like niche build. And then F tier is like genuinely like either worse than a legendary or like, why are you taking this, right? So that's kind of like the tier identity. So D tier is kind of just like a pool. It's like a pretty big tier. It's just a pool of like exotics that are like, they're good, they're pretty good exotics, but where are you using them? You know, it's kind of like that. So like Fourth Horseman doesn't fit there, obviously, because Fourth Horseman is like pretty clearly like it has a defined niche, whereas like Merciless is like, where are you really using Merciless these days? You know, it needs a kill, you know. Anyways, I've talked for long enough. Let's move on. Buried Bloodline, we just talked about. Cloud Strike really fell off. I mean, it's just more that the sandbox around Cloud Strike has shifted upward, not that Cloud Strike has been nerfed or anything. Its DPS, if you compare it to like the top performing exotic primaries, is not that impressive. Its total damage got hit by the reserve nerf to exotics. Again, not that impressive, right? It's kind of okay. So I just placed it in the D tier because like it's not, if Fourth Horseman, again, like we talked about, C tier, defined niche. It's definitely taken by people in certain circumstances. Cloud Strike, it's just like day one, speedrunning. Speedrunning, it's used in like starting raw and third encounter. But besides that, like, where are you using this gun? Where are you using this gun? You know? Like, if you want to extend total damage in your energy slot, there's plenty of other options that you can do that with. And it's just like Cloud Strike, it's like, just like, why are you using this gun? You know? So it's kind of tough. It's kind of tough. Dead Messenger, unchanged, but I did want to talk about a lot of weapons moved down a tier. And I didn't move Dead Messenger down a tier because... So if a weapon stayed in the same tier and was like unchanged, it's kind of a sign of the weapon's resiliency, or it's like the weapon is actually better. And so I didn't move it down a tier like I did for a lot of weapons. So Dead Messenger is one of these weapons because of its triple wave buff. Its triple wave buff essentially tripled its total damage. And yeah, it's like great for chunky mini bosses now. Has demo, has fundamentals, you know, 30% buff. It is a wave frame, unfortunately. So like its total damage and in terms of like ad clear and its ammo efficiency is not going to be as good as something like an area denial. But it's pretty decent, you know, and I thought I put in the D tier. Izanagi's Burden. This one took a big fall, right? From B to D tier. And I think the reason for this is because Izanagi's niche used to be burst crit damage or damage rotations. In the first slot, we have New Land Beyond, which is way more ammo efficient than Izanagi's Burden. Like, imagine using Izanagi's Burden on Kurego's crits on day one. You would literally be out of special ammo once you're done helping with like 4 or 5 crits, right? Whereas New Land Beyond, you're smiling your way to the bank. You haven't even dumped a mag with 4 or 5 crits, right? So New Land Beyond is like, you know, obviously excellent for this stuff. Yeah, like Izanagi's Burden is just such a compressed niche now, and you don't really use it for damage rotations now either. So I don't know, tough to find a spot to live for Izanagi's Burden. Fourth Horseman in speedrunning definitely has like a niche. Izanagi's Burden not so much anymore. I mean, maybe for like tormentors and stuff like that, people still use it, but I don't know. It's pretty limited in its application now. And then finally, Forerunner. Forerunner, I actually moved from the C tier down to the E tier. I think I overrated Forerunner really, really heavily. Specifically, its Rock Grenade. This Rock Grenade, I will definitely test it. I don't know if it scales with 200 Grenade. I mean, it kind of counts as a grenade ability for like, I think, Verity and stuff. So its grenade damage is like pretty decent, I believe. But it's like, yeah, the radius is really small. And it's like, I just don't know why you would use this gun in today's meta. Maybe it's deserving of a D tier, right? But when you compare it to stuff like, I don't know, Exderis, you know, Duality, Agar Scepter, you know, that's also in the E tier. I don't think it's in necessarily horrible company. So I'm going to leave it in the E tier, and we'll move on to power weapons. Yeah, so you'll notice, like, you know, the tier list is a lot more strict this season, but I think exotics as a whole have really been kind of, I don't know, like it's a tough spot for them because, you know, total damage nerfs and stuff like that. And, you know, we really favor total damage these days, which means a lot of exotic primaries have been buffed, and then primaries have been buffed. There's, you know, SMGs with PKs and stuff like that are basically performing at the same level as like most exotic specials. It's a tough time for exotics, is what I'm saying. Okay. So heavies, let's talk about this. A lot of heavy changes. Finality's Augur is unchanged, but similar reason to Dead Messenger, right? Like I didn't move it down like I did for a lot of weapons because I think overall it's increased. I'm a bit of a predictive guy. You know, Finality's Augur, I did say it would essentially replace Anarchy in like sniper rotations and you know, a special weapon like total damage rotations because the quality of life buffs were enough. It got bait and switch, it got a damage buff. All this stuff was enough to increase the swap DPS over Anarchy. And I literally said, this weapon is insanely brain dead compared to Anarchy, where you have to refresh the traps every... Listen, the main disadvantage with Anarchy is that the traps only last 10 seconds, right? They only last 10 seconds. And once you refresh your cycle 3 times, aka 30 seconds, aka 6 traps, you need to manually reload the gun. With Finality's Augur, this is never the case, right? When you deploy a turret successfully, it reloads your mag, right? It reloads your mag when you like target and you do all that stuff. So you can infinitely cycle this thing, right? You never need to reload it. And all you need to do is every 25 seconds, not 10 seconds, every 25 seconds, you gotta pop a turret in the air, mark a guy, and then you go back to doing whatever you want with your other weapons, right? So Finality's Augur is just the direct replacement to Anarchy for the kind of heavy swap DPS option for like long extended phases. And Finality's Augur has higher total damage by like a significant margin as well. So a solid swap total DPS option, but I would say not relevant in most endgame scenarios. It's used in some encounters in speedrunning to like trap doors, but Anarchy is better than that at that for a lot of door trapping encounters. And then it's potentially used in day one stuff because it has a lot of total damage, like a lot, right? It has a lot of total damage for a boss like Corregos. So yeah, because of that, Finalized Augur going to be in the C tier. I don't think it's as universal as some of the stuff in the B tier and the A tier, but yeah, it's definitely useful for total damage in scenarios where you would previously consider using something like Anarchy Sniper. Next up, we have the D tier. Anarchy, I moved it down from C to D tier. It's just worse than Finalities outside of certain speedrunning encounters. No reason to use this gun over Finalities. Legend of Acreus, I moved from C to D tier. I think it's much less relevant in the current sandbox. I mean, Lord of Wolves is still dominating this gun for any sort of shotgun level boss. And Lord of Wolves also has the benefit of being able to start with an exotic heavy, like you saw many people do on contest, and then swap to Lord of Wolves, and you have full Lord of Wolves ammo as long as you had full energy special. There's no penalty between, you know, for switching between special weapons. So Legend of Acreus, for that reason, you know, definitely a lot more niche. I mean, I guess you can make the argument that you could start on Acreus and swap to Lord of Wolves. I think a lot of people did it on Wyvern day one, but I still think Acreus is a way less relevant weapon. Especially with like reserve nerfs and stuff like that. There's a lot of exotic heavies, Parasite and Finality's Augur, that are less restrictive in terms of like the boss models that they can be used on, like the ranges they can be used on. Just more useful overall and have higher total damage. So that's all I wanted to say about Legend of Acreus. Next up, we have Thunderlord. Thunderlord, I moved from B to D tier. Thunderlord is really suffering right now because it does like 2,700 DPS from what I know. And optimized, not even fully optimized, but like semi-optimized SMG PK DPS is up there, right? And arguably, I think generates super faster. So yeah, Thunderlord is just eclipsed by certain primaries. All the exotic heavies that people used to favor for being like consistent total damage options, like sustained damage options, like Thunderlord Div on day one, are kind of all being eclipsed by primaries, whether we're talking Outbreak, whether we're talking Hierarchy, whether we're talking PK SMGs, whether we're talking Lucky Man's hand cannons. Like all of these options have been buffed on top of like a weapons 200, buffing them higher than like a heavy weapon does, but 15%. So yeah, Thunderlord is definitely like suffering a little bit. And of course the exotic, you know, reserve nerfs and just reserve nerfs in general, sorry, not specifically exotic, but reserve nerfs in general didn't do it any favors either. We also have Whirling Ovation, which I placed into the D tier, right? Unproven weapon, probably needs a catalyst to be viable. You guys saw my video where I tested the DPS of every exotic weapon. It's nothing special when it comes to ad clear, so really you're just going to be focusing on using it for DPS. And when it comes to DPS, the anticipation meter just takes too long to charge in my opinion. And even when it's full, the gun just takes too long to charge. And so the swap DPS ends up being worse than Parasite. The total damage is similar, but doesn't offer the same benefits like Worm Byproduct that Parasite has. And the risk of blowing yourself up is, I'd say it's pretty similar, I guess, actually. But Parasite, once you're at 0 stacks, is like pretty safe. But your first 20-time shot, I guess. I've definitely seen some of my contest teammates like blow themselves up during practice. So I can't really comment on that. Okay, next up we have the Queenbreaker. Queenbreaker, I've moved big fall off here from B down to E tier, okay? And it's joined by stuff like Microcosm, Whisper, and Darcy, which is maybe surprising to you guys, but these weapons were very heavily reliant on their total damage, and now their total damage is not anything to write home about. It's not particularly impressive. You can easily match that total damage. You can easily beat that total damage by a lot using stuff like New Land Beyond and Finality's Augur. And the DPS comparison, those weapons are going to end up being better. They're going to be better than Queenbreaker and Whisper. And so Queenbreaker and Whisper, they were definitely like around for like a season or two, and people definitely used them because they were high up on the damage charts, but they were hit pretty hard. A lot of exotics were hit pretty hard, but like Queenbreaker especially, for example, was hit really hard by the exotic reserve nerfs. And in a meta where basically like these weapons are suffering in both directions, right? They're being pulled in two directions. At the top end, we are in a sandbox where damage phases are getting longer and bosses have more total health. And then on the other end, their reserves are getting cut because of how reserves were changed. Like, inventory size was changed to the ammo generation stat, like 1-to-1. And so because of this, like, they're kind of like left stranded, right? And so a lot of these weapons that relied on that Queenbreaker, Whisper, Microcosm, all being shifted down. Queenbreaker went from B to E tier, Microcosm went from C to E tier, Whisper went from C to E tier, all the same reason as Queenbreaker. Darcy, also I moved from C to E tier, like I just mentioned. This is mostly because with legendary snipers, like, it's decent, but it's not like that much of a boon. It's not as big of a boon as like Galley, for example, where it's like a 26-27% increase. It's 15% damage, but it's just not mind-blowing. It's just not mind-blowing. I don't know, if we see snipers take over or like legendary snipers get a buff, I could see Darcy definitely moving up the ranks, but for now at least, like, this is kind of a usage rate thing. Like, I think it is low-key, like, kind of decent, but it's, I don't know, the total damage and the DPS are just, everyone is using Parasite Finality with like Mint or Sniper or whatever these days, and yeah, I just don't think Darcy really has that much of a place in the sandbox. You could argue it could be D tier, but it is what it is. And then finally, the last two things I want to talk about for heavy weapons. Winterbite moved from C to E tier because the Glaive melee nerfs hit it pretty hard, like really hard. And so yeah, it's in the E tier now. There are plenty of melee options now that are as good as Winterbite without as much setup. Like literally Throwing Hammer is like in the same department as Winterbite now. And then Grapple melee, we don't even need to talk about that. It's like absolutely destroying Winterbite and Glaive melees right now. So yeah, in the E tier. And then finally, we have a Wardcliff Coil, which I've moved from the C tier to the F tier because Wardcliff, I used to say like, oh, it's good for elite scaling. Like there's bosses that it could be good for, that are elites or whatever. And even on Dolan Karu, like in speedruns and stuff, people don't use Wardcliff anymore. They just Golden Gun her and like damage super her and stuff. Like, Wardcliff is just like, it's just worse than a legendary rock. You just don't use the gun. Even after the bull charge change, like just don't use the gun. So yeah, it's in the F tier. That's that. And yeah, that's pretty much it for power weapons. And then finally, the last section of this video, we're going to talk about utility weapons. So utility. There we go. Boom. So utility. Let's talk about the C tier because we talked about the stuff in the top 3 tiers. Alethanum, unchanged. I didn't move it down. Ammo generation and movement, still relevant niches. People did use them on day 1 Desert Perpetual for like, after an encounter's over, you're all out of kinetic ammo. You just swap to Alethanum and you basically use it like mountaintop and you boost yourself through the transition. You stick some mini bosses with it. I saw a lot of people doing that. I did that. I know other top teams were doing that. They were just, sticking bosses with Alethanum and making heavy off of them, which is kind of fun and nice. And the DPS isn't terrible as well. It's not horrible. Even if you like stick a boss a bunch of times, the DOT does stack to some degree and impact damage of the Alethanum is like pretty decent as well. So yeah, put in the C tier because it does fill a relevant niche. And then Ergo, big drop. I moved it from A to C tier. I think I overrated it for DPS last patch. You have to keep in mind that the big benefit with swords and their identity is they're a melee damage option, like a melee range option that has a lot of total damage, right? And so the implication is that you're using it for a longer phase. You're not using swords on stuff like Atrax, I guess, because, it's a much shorter phase. So Ergo is like, you need Transcendence for Ergo to be useful for DPS outside of Pack Hunter Ergo, which is like a utility thing. You need Transcendence. And if you need Transcendence, that's not lasting you more than like 25 seconds, right? So even though the ammo economy is fine with the Catalyst, it's just not going to last you very long. And on a long phase, it's just, it's not as good, I would say. And I think it's in good company with the stuff in the C tier. Like, it's a utility option that's not as relevant as Galley, I would say. Rockets definitely have like a strong optimized niche, whereas swords are like definitely like a more of a preference thing, right? More of a preference thing for most bosses. And then Ergo is just like, yeah, you take it if you need like Pack Hunter there. So really, I don't know. Ergo's most common endgame niche, I would say these days, is probably like speedrunning stuff. But outside of that, it's just a chill weapon. It's just a chill weapon. It goes in the C tier. That's fine. Icebreaker, I moved from D to C tier. I think I underrated it for fast ammo generation, especially in this new system with deterministic ammo. It's really nice to have like a guaranteed source that doesn't require you to like farm ads too much. Like Icebreaker gets ammo like crazy fast, like crazy fast. So I will say, if you guys haven't tried Icebreaker, if you don't need like an exotic heavy on for an encounter, Icebreaker generates ammo like insanely fast, like insanely fast on getting other kills. So shout out Icebreaker. And then we have 2 more weapons to talk about. Divinity, I moved it down from the C tier to the D tier. This is perhaps the least relevant Divinity has been in years. Even on day 1, right? On day 1 where Divinity used to shine, people were like, yeah, use Div Linear, Div Cloud Strike, Div whatever. Div is like super consistent on these bosses, makes your damage consistent. Even on bosses where people were using Thunderlord, everybody prefers Tractor. To be fair, right? These bosses, except for Wyvern, their crits are pretty easy to hit, right? Maybe Hobgoblin is kind of annoying, but the other ones are pretty easy to hit, right? And so you can make that argument, but I'd say damage is a more sensitive issue these days. People are always going to prefer a 30% debuff over a 15% debuff. Div is really just like, this is possibly the least relevant it has been in like years. And so yeah, I put in the D tier. And then finally, Edge of Action. Edge of Action, I moved it from D to C tier. I do think I underrated its defensive utility in contest. The fact that any subclass can put this on pretty much and have just like a really, really strong, high health defensive bubble that they can give to a teammate that's in a vulnerable position. Just really nice. And like, the damage buff is not amazing or anything, but I do think I underrated its utility in, harder content. So I placed it in the C tier, and that's that. Okay, so that's pretty much it for the whole tier list. I hope you guys enjoyed. I will leave a summary and outline of what I just talked about in the description in like a little Google Doc. And then you can also view the full changelog as well if you're interested in that. A lot of the changelog stuff I didn't mention because it's literally just, I moved this weapon down 1 tier because I made the tiers stricter this season. That's all, right? So yeah, this is a pretty strict tier list, but I've gotten some positive feedback about tier lists being strict. A lot of YouTuber tier lists are like a little too lax and they just kind of put stuff in higher tiers because like their chat tells them to, or they put stuff in higher tiers because it's like a personal favorite of theirs, or I really try to keep it objective here. And the S tier is really, truly exceptional stuff, right? We're not going to put stuff in the S tier that's just like, oh, everybody likes this weapon, right? So I'm ranting, but the main point is, yes, I know the tier list is very restrictive. We literally have 10 weapons in the top 3 tiers, but I do think this is a low point for exotic weapons in general, outside of the ones that are truly exceptional. So it really makes the exceptional ones stand out, right? Stuff like Fire Tractor, Parasite, stuff like that. And then, some of the lower tiers, like don't feel too bad about like certain weapons being in like the D tier, the E tier. D tier is not even like bad weapons, right? You have stuff like Thunderlord in here, you have Tessellation in here, you have like Malfeasance, Hierarchy, right? Hierarchy is a temporary placement, but you know what I mean. So yeah, that's it. I'll link the tier list in the description as well. And you guys have yourself a wonderful day. I love all of you. And, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, maybe a comment about some of the stuff that I've talked about in this video, feel free to leave it down in the comments. You know the drill. And I'll see you around. Bye-bye.